So we've got a massive new update in one of the biggest election law fights that's currently happening in the country, because currently the federal court in Alabama has now issued a new major ruling against the state's congressional maps, and they blocked Alabama's congressional map yet again. And now Alabama has already fired back with a brand new emergency appeal that's going straight to the Supreme Court. So this election fight is officially heading back in front of the Supreme Court on an emergency basis. So let's talk about what exactly happened in this new ruling, what are the major implications of that, and what is currently going to happen now that this is heading back to the Supreme Court. Now, before we jump into this video, if you want to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply by subscribing. You can also hit the like button that just tells the algorithm that you appreciate this content, and so it shares it with more people. Now, as you may recall, the Supreme Court recently issued a major remand order in this Alabama congressional redistricting/election case after its new 6-3 ruling in a case called Louisiana versus Calais. Importantly, the court here did not outright rule that Alabama automatically wins their case. Instead, the Supreme Court vacated the lower court's permanent injunction and sent the case back down to that court for reconsideration under that new Supreme Court framework. Now, after emergency briefing happened and emergency oral arguments happened in the Alabama District Court, a 3-judge panel in the federal court has now ruled against Alabama once again and issued a new preliminary injunction blocking the state from using its 2023 congressional map for the upcoming elections. The court stated that even after reconsidering the case under the Supreme Court's new framework, the judges still believe that Alabama's map likely involved intentional racial discrimination and unlawful vote dilution. The court also ordered that Alabama needed to continue to use the court-ordered remedial map that was already being used in recent elections. Alabama has now immediately appealed that ruling back to the United States Supreme Court, meaning that this case is once again likely heading towards another major Supreme Court showdown. Now, the major headline is that the 3-judge panel here in Alabama has officially granted that new preliminary injunction blocking Alabama from using its 2023 congressional map for the upcoming 2026 elections. The court, through this new ruling, ordered that Alabama had to use the remedial map that was being used during the 2024 elections and recently was used during the 2026 primary elections. And the language from the court in this ruling is very interesting. The judges stated that they cannot see any way to force Alabama residents to vote under a map they believe was tainted by intentional race-based discrimination. So the Alabama court here believes that there was discrimination, and so they do not want to put in place the 2023 map. Again, that is a huge statement coming from the court because remember, after the Supreme Court's recent Calais decision, Alabama argued that the legal framework had dramatically changed and that the state should now be allowed to restore its original legislatively enacted map that happened in 2023. But the district court flatly rejected those arguments. The judges said that even after conducting what they described was an exacting review of the entire record in light of that new Supreme Court ruling, they still reached the same exact conclusion. According to the court, Alabama intentionally diluted black voting strength when it enacted that 2023 congressional map. The court specifically said that Alabama knowingly refused to create an additional black opportunity district despite prior court rulings that required one to be in place. Again, that is a very strong statement coming from this federal court. They believe that this 2023 map should not be allowed at all. Now, another huge part of this ruling is that the federal court directly rejected Alabama's arguments that politics, not race, drove the districting decisions and the change in the 2023 map. Now, that issue matters enormously because the Supreme Court's new Calais decision emphasized separating race from politics in Voting Rights Act cases. Alabama argued that the legislator was simply trying to preserve Republican political strength and protect communities of interest to Republicans. But the district court said that the enormous record that they had contains no evidence of partisan motives. In other words, the judges here did not buy Alabama's argument that this was merely and purely based on politics and political line drawing. Instead, the court believed, in their opinion, that the evidence still pointed towards intentional racial discrimination. Now, one of the most important parts of this ruling may be what the judges said about the current remedial map, because Alabama argued that this remedial map that was put in place by the court itself actually violated the Supreme Court's new Calais framework by relying too heavily on race. But the district court pushed back extremely hard against those arguments. The judges repeatedly emphasized that the special map here was drawn race blind. So they said that when the court and their individual who did the map, when they drew the lines, they believed that they had no race or anything like that involved at all. Now, another major issue in this case involved the Supreme Court's Purcell Doctrine. The doctrine generally warns federal courts against changing election rules too close to an election because of the risk of voter confusion and election chaos. Alabama here argued that the federal courts should not intervene this late in the election cycle and instead allow the 2023 map to be put in place. And they had already sent out notice, I believe, 10, 11, 12 days ago to all voters saying that the new 2023 map was going to be used. But once again, the district court rejected Alabama's position. The court found that keeping the remedial map would actually create less confusion than switching back to Alabama's 2023 map. And because of that, the court concluded that the Purcell Doctrine did not block the injunction that they just issued. Now, I want to note that maybe one of the most interesting parts of this ruling that came from the court is what the district court implied about the Supreme Court itself and the Supreme Court's recent remand of this very case. The judges essentially suggested that if the Supreme Court truly wanted Alabama's original 2023 map immediately to be restored, well, then the Supreme Court could have simply stayed the prior injunction outright. But they argued that the court instead vacated and remanded the case to them for further review. The district court interpreted that move as a signal that the lower court was still expected to carefully reconsider the case and potentially act before the 2026 election. That is a very important point because it shows that the lower court here believes, and in their opinion, they believe that they still had substantial authority here despite the Supreme Court's recent remand of this case. Now, because of this new ruling, this case is now already heading back to the Supreme Court on an emergency basis. Within hours of this ruling coming from the court, Alabama officially filed a notice of appeal, a writ of cert, to the Supreme Court of the United States. So now we are very likely heading towards another emergency showdown at the Supreme Court level over Alabama's congressional districts. That means that the Supreme Court will once again have to weigh in on this election issue on an emergency basis. And the stakes here are massive because congressional redistricting directly impacts the balance of power in the House of Representatives. And ultimately, that could impact things like federal legislation, oversight of agencies like the ATF and the DOJ, judicial confirmation, so what judges are going to be in federal courts, and broader constitutional fights involving other issues like we talk about here on the channel a lot, including the Second Amendment. So that's the latest major update in the Alabama redistricting battle. Again, this is developing very fast because of the looming elections. The federal district court has now blocked Alabama's 2023 congressional map yet again. They doubled down on findings of intentional racial discrimination and ordered the state to continue using the court-ordered remedial special master map, and they are forced to use those for the upcoming elections as of right now. But Alabama has already appealed directly back to the Supreme Court, asking for the Supreme Court to review this ruling and also likely order that the 2023 map be used for the upcoming elections. So the fight is absolutely not over. This is only going to escalate even more. Again, this is going to force the Supreme Court to once again weigh in on this Alabama congressional map issue before this upcoming election. And again, this has broad-reaching implications for the upcoming election, not just in Alabama, but far beyond as well. So as things develop, like I said, this is going to develop fast. We're going to get information probably fairly fast on this. As we get this, as it unravels more, I will let you guys know. If you like this video and you would like to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply to like, comment, and subscribe. All of those things help to fuel the algorithm and just tells the algorithm that you appreciate this content, and so it shares it with more people. But as always, thank you so much for all of your support, and never forget this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.